Greetings, ladies and intelligence, and welcome to this latest edition of Read TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Interventions, written by Infernalism. There are 6 layers of spacefaring civilization. They range from fledgling societies just barely able to escape the bonds of their homeworld's gravity, to godlike societies that manipulate whole universes for their own unknowable reasons. Each layer is distinct, with its own particulars, goals, and traits. But we won't be talking about those higher layers of civilization. We're going to be talking about the second and third layers. The second layer is composed of those civilizations that have begun to reach out into space, having explored and colonized their own systems. They now reach out to other worlds, full of bright hope, broadcasting out into the void, hoping to find others to join the great galactic stage. The third layer is composed of those from the second layer that have managed to survive their naivety, and those that prey on those in the second layer. Aggressive, selfish, and jaded, these surviving species have embraced might makes right, and have shared their hopes and dreams of a bright, glorious future. If the higher layers are aware of these vandals, they do not care, and they do not intervene. There are those who have long pondered what great filter exists in the universe that strains out the teeming life that the universe must hold, so vast and inviting to life as it is. What these pondering souls fail to understand is that there is no single great filter. There are many. This is a story of one. The Bardem were only one of 1,000 warlord species that filled the spiral, traveling from system to system, looking for worlds to plunder and scavenge from, running and hiding from those greater species who technologically outweighed their own. Once they'd been poets and artists, but that had been many generations ago, when they first reached out beyond their own long-lost home world. If any existed still, they explored their art on what little downtime was allotted to them. Once a species of billions, the many years since their world had been conquered and scavenged had reduced their number to a hard and jaded fraction. A few 100,000 remained, though the Bardem say that many millions more existed back on their homeworld, enslaved by the greater power that had descended upon them. But those that had escaped had become something stronger, sharper. Like carbon put through endless pressure and time, they had become something terrible in its simple beauty, a reflection of the horror committed against them. Worst of all, it had begun with such a high purpose, to find a way to build themselves up into a force capable of retaking their homeworld. Instead, existence had turned them into one of 1,000 warlord hordes roaming the reaches of the spiral. Today, the only art that the Bardem appreciated were the arts of tracking and scavenging. Nomadic by necessity, plunderers by habit, they celebrated the most ruthless amongst their number, and elevated those best trackers to hunter status, leaders of all. And perhaps in a bit of divine irony, the Bardem were gifted listeners with an ear for song and sound, a trait that had been turned to listening to the stars themselves and the signals that flowed through the empty stretches of space. They moved through the stars almost aimlessly, drifting from one region to another, searching for worlds worthy of plunder, looking for resources, materials, new technologies. Imagine, if you can, 100 ragtag ships, many makes and models, the result of uncounted plundered worlds, but the core remains the same. Old and hardened, crusted with weaponry and armor, a fog of small drone ships encircling each ship, constantly watching for signs of danger. Suicidal proto-AI guiding these tiny vessels, and committed to violence in the name of survival. But beneath all the layers of hard years and terrible decisions, the ships still held their own initial shape, and if you squint just right, you can see the flowing lines of these star cruisers, the artistry in their design, built like birds from their own lost world. Imagine those ships going through a flurry of activity. Drones were called, ships drawn into formation, with some ships being drawn into other, larger vessels, and others still magnetically locking onto other, even larger ships. A gathering energy as the ships turn in unison, and great swelling of power envelops them all before their FTL engines kick and the ships are just gone. In a moment's time, the great pack is gone, surging towards its newest target and newest prey. Aboard the flagship, they sing loud and long, praising the hunter whose ears had found a new signal in the great emptiness, the first one in 5 years. The song sang of finding the tools of the gods needed to rescue their loved ones, but there was no hope in their hearts, only greed for what lay before them. Perhaps their elders still had that hope, but it had been a very, very long time since anyone had asked about returning home. Those same elders still spoke about their gods and their infinite wisdom and their great patience. They spoke longingly of lost homes and lost temples, but they made no great effort to guide their people, perhaps out of despair, or perhaps they no longer believed in those gods, feeling betrayed and abandoned. They saw no reason to cling to powerless deities that saw fit to leave them adrift and homeless. Whatever the case may be, when their ships were suddenly crashing out of FTL space and into real space without reason or warning, many of the Barden remembered their gods and called out for mercy. "Watcher, report!" Smoke and sharp high-pitched squeals filled the room. Alarms, and the smell of burning circuitry, and a dozen voices yelling in a mix before they were silenced by howls of furious indignation from the first hunter. To look upon Birdham was to see a strange mix of wolf and bear, tall and hunched, elongated jaws with great scoop ears that could and did pivot this way and that. Smooth fur, short and purely cosmetic by this point, long-limbed and the most intricate of hands, 6 fingers and an extra joint to those fingers that allowed them to work their instruments with incredible speed and dexterity. "Report, Scott, be damned!" "Sir, the fleet's fallen out of FTL, reason unknown. All ships are reporting damage to their engines along with our own. FTL engines are offline. Engineers are reporting, stating that a massive damage has been done. They're screaming that we need to stop to assess the damage." "Can't, we're venting atmosphere." This came from the hunter's second, a quiet elder that had been his second for a very long time, long enough for him to trust him without a second's thought. A dreadful thought that, slowly suffocating as the air hissed out into space. "Watcher, direct the engineers to do what repairs they can while en route. Do not inform them of the atmosphere leakage. That goes for you all. Second, find me a world." "Directly ahead of us, Hunter. It's the world we were tracking. Orientation, we're approaching from system south." From directly beneath them, so to speak. "Set intercept course and begin scanning for technology as soon as we're within range." With something to do, the crew fell silent again, leaving the hunter alone with his thoughts and fears. If this target world was tech-heavy, they'd be struck either attacking without an avenue for escape or being at the mercy of a foreign power. Neither of which appealed to the hunter. Already, he was drawing upon 30 years of experience, assessing strategies for the dismal situation and not finding any optimal solutions. It all came to surprise and catching them off their guard, getting into a good strategic location, perhaps juicing over their capital and, of course, being so focused on what lay before him, they neglected to think of what lay behind. They lost 3 cruisers before they were even aware of the attacking ships. Headlong retreat had not been foremost in the hunters' plans for approach, but they were really out of ideas. Pursued by alien ships of some unknown design, but purely lethal in speed and force, the hunter made a hard decision and ordered 2 ships to lag behind and set up a screen for the retreating fleet. Had they the time and weren't currently leaking atmosphere, he'd have ordered a stand, but with his ship and 3 dozen others reporting the same structural damage, they had no choice. They had to get onto a habitable world before they all died. They would mourn the 2 ships and their crews later when they had the time. If they had the time. If they survived. A possibility that grew increasingly less likely. He realized with cold dread when his watchers began reporting that dozens of other ships were on intercept course from the nearby system. A trap. They'd been baited into a trap. A bait that had been laid in front of them and they'd happily dove into the net, thinking only of easy prey and easy glory and loot. And now they would die. "Hunter, I'm getting initial tech scans from the world ahead." "Let me guess, high-tech and aggressive." It was their ships that had ambushed them. It was their tech that had destroyed their FTL engines. And it was their ships who were in attack vectors with his fleet. His people, they were all going to die here, abandoned and lost, and yet they had come to plunder and kill and scavenge. For the greater good, he told himself, for their lost world. So lost was he in his own despair that he missed the response for the first time. What? Say again? Average tech, lower than our own, but I'm picking up something in orbit. We're being hailed. Translating. Gibberish, squawks and squeals and other nonsense flowed out of the speakers as the translator program brute-forced its way through the message, while intercepting ships were closing in. All ships redirect as much power to the engines as possible. Launch drones and set to defense intercept on screen. How long had it been since they had to run from a fight like this? Not since their last attempt to liberate their homeworld, long before his time as a hunter. So ironic that he and his people would die here, in retreat and disgrace. Hunter scans report orbital defense satellites, plasma base, long range, and they're turned on us. Yes, of course. He'd let his fleet be herded into a trap. Second, prepare to order a complete halt. Weapons officers prepare to order drones in aggressive stances. Watchers relay to all ships to slave their targeting systems to their own and form defensive positions around us. That the largest and most powerful of their guns defending the flagship would be key to their survival, and yet... Hunter, we have 20 minutes of atmosphere left in vented compartments. Understood. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'd rather die quick than suffocate. Second signal, the fleet to stop. A final screening from the translator, and then a new message was bombarding them. I repeat, vessels on approach. Lower your weapons and defensive shields. We are transmitting safe passage coordinates through the orbital mines. If you do not lower your weapons and shields, you will be destroyed. Repeated twice before anyone reacted, and it was only the noise of the drones exploding behind them, echoing through fleet comm systems, woke them up to reality. Hunter, his watchers, were staring at the monitors with increasing horror. Whatever was behind them and to the sides was tearing through the drones with a vengeance. Death behind them, death on either side, and death standing before them, smiling and promising safe passage. Just lower your guns and come within range of our weapon satellites. Death smiled at them with that bony grin and promised to save them. Watcher! Receiving navigational coordinates, simple design, our systems translated it almost instantly. It maps out a path to approach to the surface. And their satellites are tracking us, armed. Another explosion came through the comms, and the monitors dispassionately noted the loss of a cruiser behind them. It was that explosion that finally woke him up, stirred him from his despair. All ships follow us in. Watchers transmit path coordinates. Second, take us in. And with that, the last hunter of the burden led his people straight into the laughing embrace of death. Kalen stood at the shade and stared up at the sudden flashing of explosions overhead. Far overhead, on the edge of space, ships, so many ships died, and he mourned. More invaders, more scavengers come to and taken by death. He stood, watched there, and waited until the explosion stopped. He sighed deeply and turned his attention back to his farm. 50 years. He'd been there 50 years, and he still never got used to the sights and sounds of explosions overhead. They'd come so close to being one of those explosions. It touched upon him. Each time he saw another invading group refuse to listen, refuse to comply, and refuse to trust. Once upon a time, he'd almost let his own distrust of existence and the horrors that he'd endured coax him into diving headlong into suicide and destruction, rather than trust an unknown voice over his comms. But instead of death, he found those satellites, turned away from him, and ordered all weapons systems offline and turned towards the pursuing ships behind him. Of his near 100 ships, 71 had survived the gauntlet. 266,000 of his warriors landed on the planet. Today they stood at 413,000, and they were farmers, craftsmen, defenders, and artists. Such artists. They occupied a big portion of the place once called Russia. It amused the humans for some reason for their kind to occupy this land. The humans apparently owned the world, but shared it, and not just with the burden. 16 other species called the planet home. All invading species, all conquerors, all scavengers, all with the same kind of story that Kaelin had shared with them, forced by circumstances into being as horrible as the universe required. And yet, now, each of them found a way to climb back down from the edge of destruction. 50 years ago, Kaelin sat with the humans that greeted them upon their landing, and had been told a story about how humanity had reached out into the stars and found a hostile galaxy waiting for them. Invaded so many times, and each time driving them away, they finally decided to find a new home in the deeper reaches of space, where they might find peace. But some remained behind. Some remained to maintain the defenses and, in time, develop a new use for the many generations of defensive technologies that they developed. The humans had baited the pathways of the nearby galaxy with radio signals that pointed the way back to Earth. But the path led through destructive subspace mines designed to destroy FTL engines. They called it the Crucible. Death on all sides and a voice offering safety before them, if they would but walk with no weapons in hand. Those races that could not do it were destroyed, either by satellites or by those invaders behind them, or fought the invaders off and conquered the part of the system for themselves, to become part of the endless trap itself. 36 invading species had claimed a part of the star system, huddled on their ships or in the crude developments on moons or in the asteroid belt, feverishly fighting each other and newcomers, constantly trying to scavenge enough to repair FTL engines that would never work within the system itself. Those that could do it could make themselves trust one last time and came in as directed, were given a place on the planet for their own. They were given a place on a ruling council, a place where they learned to coexist and trust again, where they learned to work with other species and grow with them. The burden flourished under Kaelin's rule. They thrived in the cold climate, so, like their lost home, and after 20 years they adopted the land formally and renamed it Barda, after their homeworld. They remembered that they had a talent for art and music, and Burdesh jazz music was favored around the world. Their skill at the saxophone was legendary due to those 2 extra long fingers. The role of hunter was banished and formally killed off in the same proclamation that renamed their new home after their old. Kaelin was now the first guide of the Bardim, though he spent most of his days farming when it was warm or foraging and crafting when it was cold. Bardesh technology was added to the collective whole, and some who could not let go of their aggression volunteered for the defensive fleet that played a secondary role to the orbital satellites that were constantly maintained. Kaelin still thought about home, constantly in fact, but that morning no longer kept him from seeing what might be had now, even as they honored what had been. Perhaps one day the Bardim might return to space and return home to try and free their world again. But when they did, they would not do it alone. The humans had promised, and he had learned to trust them. But for today, the once hunter called his 2 sons. The fields weren't going to harvest themselves. End of story. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters: Bushmaster 117, Casper Arnholtz, Draxzoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.